Have you ever sat in a church pew or maybe a university class and felt like you were being asked to lobotomize half of your brain just to fit in? If you are a logical thinker, a natural skeptic, or someone whose brain is hardwired to look for the how and the why, then you know exactly what friction I'm talking about. On the one side, you have traditional religious dogma. It offers community, purpose, and a sense of the divine. But the admission price is often blind faith. It demands that you ignore glaring historical inconsistencies in ancient texts, and worse, it often uses fear of hell, fear of exclusion, to keep you from asking too many questions. Now, on the other side, you have the prevailing worldview of modern science, strict, reductionist materialism. This is the belief that you are nothing but a meat computer. It tells you that consciousness is just a chemical accident, an illusion created by your brain. It tells you that love, morality, and purpose are just evolutionary tricks to keep the species breeding, and that when you die, the screen just goes black. Now, neither of those options feels quite right, do they? Welcome to Overcoming Belief Traps. I'm your host, Pierre Walters, and if you pressed play on this episode, you and I are probably a lot alike. Both of these worldviews, dogmatic religion and strict materialism, feel like dead ends because they are dead ends. They are belief traps. Let me tell you a bit about how I got caught in the trap. I was raised in a fairly conservative Christian home, Adventist actually. Many people think that the Adventist church is a cult. I disagree with that, I don't think that, but having grown up in that organization, I certainly could see where some of the rather traditional and conservative ways that they handle things like the gospel or food, diet, the Sabbath, how those things are handled could raise some eyebrows. I was raised not really to ask questions and certainly not to ask deep questions. And if I did ask deep questions, then to ignore the answers because, quite frankly, if God didn't answer it directly, then it wasn't meant for us to know. And unfortunately, that was always fairly difficult for me. Now, I know that I can't know everything, but I think the challenge for me was to become comfortable in applying that same line of thought in every area where it is relevant. I can't know everything. That's important, because if I'm agnostic in one area, then maybe it stands to reason that I should reflect on whether I might be agnostic in another. Or a better way of putting this is if I happen to be agnostic to, say, the Greek gods, Zeus, etc., Poseidon, all those things, or the Indian gods, or the Hindu gods, or whatever the other gods that exist, and we know there's thousands of them, then what's to say that I might need to consider the agnosticism in the God that I was raised understanding? And that's the crux of the issue, isn't it? When we leave the grid, the rigid structures of our childhood faith, society hands us a false dichotomy. It says, you don't believe the earth was created in 6 literal days, then fine. Then you must believe that absolutely nothing matters. The universe is random and spirituality is just a psychological crutch for the weak. But here's the truth that took me years to figure out. The choice between intellect and spirit is a lie. You do not have to check your brain at the door to understand the nature of reality. In fact, your intellect, your skepticism, and your demand for logical consistency are the exact tools that you need to build a robust, no-nonsense spiritual framework. Now let's break down why both of these traps fail the logic test, starting with strict materialism. Materialism assumes that matter is the fundamental building block of reality. It's an assumption. Quarks make atoms. Atoms make molecules. Molecules make brain cells. And somehow, if you get enough brain cells firing together, they miraculously create experience. They create the taste of coffee, the feeling of grief, the subjective experience of being you. In science and philosophy, this is called the hard problem of consciousness. And despite decades of neuroscience, no one has even come close to explaining how unconscious matter suddenly wakes up and becomes self-aware. Materialism completely fails to explain the one thing that you can be 100% certain of: your own consciousness, your own experience. Now, let's look at the other trap: dogmatic religion. You see, the problem with dogma isn't that it's entirely devoid of truth. The problem is that it takes complex metaphysical realities and shrinks them down into rigid, literal rules to control human behavior. Dogma tells you that God is an angry guy on a throne keeping a ledger of your mistakes. It fails the logic test because an infinite, all-knowing creator being petty, jealous, and demanding of human worship simply doesn't make logical sense. It sounds like a human projection, not a universal truth. So, if materialism is incomplete and dogmatic religion is distorted, then where does that leave us? Well, it leaves us in the middle, looking for a new paradigm. Throughout this podcast, we're going to explore a different model of reality. We're going to look at the intersection of quantum physics, information theory, and the science of consciousness. Specifically, we'll be using the groundbreaking work of physicist Thomas Campbell and his My Big Toe, or theory of everything, as our guide. We're going to explore the idea that consciousness isn't created by the brain. Instead, consciousness is fundamental. It is the underlying fabric of reality. And the physical universe is more like a highly complex, constrained virtual reality, a simulation generated by consciousness for consciousness, so that we can learn, evolve, and grow. Suddenly, you don't need blind faith because you have a logical framework. You can look back at the religions you left behind and you realize that they weren't entirely wrong. They were just using the limited vocabulary of ancient agrarian societies to describe a massive, consciousness-based system. Over the coming weeks or months, we're going to tear down these belief traps, and we're going to discuss how to engage your logical mind while exploring the metaphysical reality. We will redefine concepts like God, like heaven, like hell, morality, and we'll consider replacing outdated metaphors with the language of physics, entropy, and data streams. We're not saying that any of these old metaphors are wrong or even inaccurate. We're simply giving them a broader context. We're giving them a new language, a language that perhaps might do a better job of describing the reality that we experience. You are allowed to ask questions here. If something doesn't make sense, you are allowed to discard it. You do not have to go on blind faith. You do not have to believe everything that you hear or read. We aren't building a new religion. We're building a model of reality that has to stand up to your scrutiny. I want to leave you with a piece of homework for this week. It's simple. Notice the dichotomy. As you go through your week, scrolling through social media, watching the news, or talking to friends, pay attention to how often society reinforces this false war between science and spirit. Notice when someone dismisses a meaningful experience as just brain chemistry. Notice when a religious person demands that you accept something just because the book says so. Identify the walls of the trap, because once you can clearly see the walls, you can start figuring out how to pick the lock. Next week, we're going to talk about how to pick that lock. I'm going to introduce you more to Thomas Campbell, explain his background in physics, and give you a friendly beginner crash course in my big theory of everything, the model. Until then, don't ignore your intellect and don't suppress your intuition. Keep thinking, keep evolving, and I'll see you next time.